The cargo freighter floated in the cold, dark space near the edge of the Red Wastes Nebula, where the stars pulsed slowly like sleepy eyes watching from a distance, and the metal skin of the ship bore scars from old journeys and rough missions. Inside one of its lower decks, far from the polished command halls, a team of maintenance workers moved through a narrow corridor, with old lights flickering overhead and the smell of burnt coolant hanging heavy in the air like old smoke that refused to leave. Among them was Lyra, a young alien technician with skin the color of pale silver and eyes that shimmered like liquid glass, and she moved with care, holding a scanning device that hummed softly in her palm as she tracked energy leaks near the main reactor pipes. Lyra had done this many times before, crawling into old engines, sealing gaps and tightening loose panels, but today something felt off, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. Her partner, an older technician named Doran, gave a short nod and pointed toward the emergency valve chamber where a leak had been detected just an hour ago, and she followed without a word, stepping over pipes and wires, listening to the low groan of the ship as if it were whispering warnings she could not yet understand. Inside the chamber, the walls pulsed with heat, and the valve console was glowing with a strange light, the containment seal halfway active and the pressure levels higher than normal. Lyra moved closer, running her fingers across the display, trying to override the seal before the adhesive system deployed, but the controls were sluggish and the failsafe kicked in before she could react. With a loud hiss and a blast of vapor, the emergency compound shot out of hidden ports and coated the valve, and everything near it, including her left arm, which had been reaching in to reset the circuit. For a second everything went still, and then the adhesive began to harden, a thick, transparent gel wrapping around her arm and sticking her to the wall like a metal statue caught mid-motion. She gasped, tried to pull back, but the substance held her fast, tightening with every breath, and she could already feel the pressure cutting off circulation, spreading numbness through her fingers. She knew this adhesive, well, it was designed to trap radiation leaks and explosive pressure, but when it touched skin or organic tissue, it became almost impossible to remove without damage. And on her homeworld, the procedure was simple and brutal. If a worker got caught, they cut the limb off before the compound reached the core nerves or entered the bloodstream, and no time was wasted arguing or hoping. Doran stared at her arm with wide eyes, then turned to call the emergency team, and she could hear the panic in his voice even though he tried to sound calm. She knew what would happen next. The med drone would come in with its blade, and the order would be given, and her arm would be gone. It was protocol. It was efficient. It was survival. She braced herself, teeth clenched, eyes closed, heart thudding like a drum against her ribs. She had always told herself she could face anything, and this was just another test, another lesson in letting go. But before the drone could enter the chamber, a new voice cut through the comm system. Sharp, steady, and human. Stand down, came the voice from the control room, and for a moment, everything froze again. Lyra opened her eyes and turned her head as best she could, and saw a tall figure stepping into the room wearing the simple blue jacket of the human crew, his face calm, but his eyes sharp and focused. His name was Mason, one of the human engineers who had joined the freighter crew 6 months ago, and though she had worked near him before, she had never spoken more than a few words to him. He moved quickly, scanning the adhesive compound and her vitals, then turned to the others and said clearly and without hesitation, "We are not cutting anything, not yet." There was silence, then disbelief. Doran stepped forward, trying to explain the protocol, the danger, the risk, but Mason only shook his head and said, "We save people first, not just pieces." He moved to Lyra's side, pulling out a small device from his kit, a human-made scanner that began pulsing soft blue lights across the compound. He spoke to her, then gently telling her to breathe, telling her he had seen worse and that he would find a way to free her without harm. Lyra stared at him, confused, unsure. Why would he do this? Why would he go against what everyone else accepted as necessary? Why would he risk her life to save an arm? She had been trained to expect loss, to accept the practical decisions of the Conde crew, and yet this human looked at her not as a liability, but as someone worth saving completely. He knelt beside her, adjusting settings, scanning the bond points, checking her pulse, and she watched his hands move with such care, such determination that it made her chest tighten with something she could not name. The adhesive compound was thick, and its core had already hardened around the valve, locking her to the wall, but Mason sprayed a cooling mist around the outer layers, slowing the reaction, and then used a thin thermal tool to soften the edge near her wrist. He worked fast but not rushed, talking to her the whole time, telling her about the materials he was using and what he needed from her, and though her arm still throbbed with pain, she found herself listening, watching, and waiting. Other crew members arrived, some alien, some human, and arguments began over the comms about delay and risk and protocol, but Mason ignored them all. He only focused on her and the tools in his hand and the challenge in front of him. Lyra could not explain it, but in that moment, surrounded by old metal and flickering lights and the weight of fear pressing in, she began to feel something shift inside her. Not hope, not yet, but something like it, something soft and growing. Time stretched the compound, fought back, but Mason kept working, and she kept breathing, and slowly the bond near her shoulder began to show signs of release. It was not over, not even close, but for the first time since the adhesive hit her skin, Lyra began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was not the only way forward. She had braced for pain, for loss, for the cold silence of an empty sleeve. But now she watched this human work like his own life depended on it, and she began to wonder what it truly meant when someone refused to give up, even when the world told them it was the only choice. And deep inside the humming walls of that old freighter, something ancient and heavy seemed to shift, as if the ship itself understood that this was no ordinary repair job. This was something else entirely, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The hallway outside the medbay buzzed with tension as voices clashed, and the smell of sterilizing chemicals mixed with engine oil filled the space in a strange contrast that made the air feel heavier than it should have been. Lyra sat in a chair, made for humans, far too wide for her slim frame, with her left arm resting inside a containment unit where low-temperature mists continued to slow the spread of the adhesive compound that still held parts of her skin and muscles in a tight grip. Her silver eyes scanned the room, not with fear, but with silent calculation, as if trying to understand this strange new direction her life had taken without warning or permission. Mason stood on the other side of the medbay, examining a stack of human diagnostic displays that showed scans of Lyra's arm, with bright veins of hardened gel weaving through muscle tissue and resting dangerously close to several major nerve clusters. He was focused, calm, and completely absorbed in the readings, while behind him a human medic named Rin adjusted the angle of the recovery bed and prepared new stabilizers with practiced hands. They moved in quiet harmony, communicating through brief glances and small gestures, while outside the medbay, the alien technicians argued over the delay, the risk, and the logic behind not following standard limb removal procedure. One of them, a tall, dark-scaled worker named Bren, entered the medbay, his voice louder than needed, his tone edged with frustration and disbelief. He looked directly at Mason and spoke with authority, saying they had already lost enough time, and if the compound reached the nerve core, Lyra's entire system could collapse. Mason didn't even look up from his work as he answered in a steady voice that they were watching every metric, every heartbeat, and every reaction in real time, and so far there was no cause to panic. Bren stepped closer, clearly irritated, and repeated that saving the arm was a waste when they could just cut and be done with it. But this time Mason turned to face him fully. He said something simple but powerful, something that froze the room for a moment. He said, "We are not machines. We do not throw away what we can still protect." Lyra heard the words and something inside her shifted again, not a dramatic surge, but more like a slow rising current beneath still waters, and it surprised her, because she had grown up in a system where practicality was everything, and feelings had no place in the protocols of survival. She looked at Mason and saw no arrogance in his face, only quiet certainty, and an unwavering commitment to something she could not yet define. The human medic. Rin stepped forward and handed Mason a compound mixture in a chilled container while explaining that the solvent was not meant for alien biology, but could possibly soften the outer layers of the adhesive if applied in small doses. It was risky. It had not been tested. There were no guarantees. Mason nodded once and said that no path with value ever comes with guarantees. Lyra felt those words land like warm stones in her chest, grounding her, keeping her from drifting into fear again. Mason moved toward her, slowly speaking as he approached, explaining everything he was about to do, asking for her permission before every step, even the small ones. Lyra had never experienced this before. On her world, medics worked fast and silent decisions were made above the injured and carried out without pause. But here this human with his rough hands and quiet voice was giving her space, giving her time, giving her choice. She nodded once, and he began applying the first layer of the solvent with a soft brush that glowed faint blue under the medbay lights. The moment the chemical touched the edge of the compound, there was a faint hiss and a shimmer as the hardened material reacted, curling slightly at the edges like burnt paper under slow flame. Mason watched carefully, noting the temperature, the speed, the resistance, and Rin recorded everything on the side screen with quiet efficiency. It was working, but only a little and very slowly. It would take hours, maybe more, and even then there was no telling if they could reach the inner layers without damaging the muscle or tissue underneath. Still, they continued slowly, carefully, and with every small success, Mason kept talking to Lyra, telling her stories from past missions where things had looked impossible, but turned out different than expected because someone had dared to try. He told her about a crewmate named Jace who had been trapped under a collapsing station, and everyone said he would die. But they kept digging, and in the end he walked out with a limp, but alive. He told her about his own sister who had once refused an emergency transplant because the odds were bad, but now she ran a clinic on Mars and trained other medics to do the impossible. These stories were strange and new to Lyra, who had always been taught that logic and speed were the only tools worth having. Hours passed and the medbay lights shifted as the ship moved slowly into a safer orbit away from the edge of the nebula. Outside the door, the arguments had faded, and now only silence remained as the crew waited, not knowing what to expect. Inside the medbay, Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, not from pain but from the weight of everything she had seen and felt in such a short time. She thought about how quickly life could change, how 1 second she was a technician doing her routine job, and the next she was a patient in the hands of a human who saw her as more than a protocol. She opened her eyes again and looked at Mason, who was now cleaning the softened area near her elbow gently, carefully, as if handling something fragile and priceless. She wanted to ask him why he cared, why he did not just follow the standard path, but the words would not come, so instead she watched and listened, and let the warmth of his presence ease the cold ache in her shoulder. In that moment, Lyra realized something important, something that would stay with her long after the adhesive was gone. She realized that humans had a strange way of moving through the universe, not always the fastest or the most logical, but with a kind of stubborn compassion that bent rules and broke barriers and reached across fear to offer something more than survival. They offered dignity. They offered connection. They offered a chance to be whole. And for the first time since the accident, she did not feel like a casualty waiting for a decision. She felt like a person with value and worth and choice. She felt like maybe this story was not about loss after all, but about a different kind of strength, one that came not from cutting away what was damaged, but from holding on to what could still be saved. The hours inside the medbay passed slowly. like drifting clouds over a quiet sea, and though the pain in Lyra's arm had settled into a dull throb, the weight in her chest had only grown heavier, not from fear, but from something she did not fully understand. Mason sat nearby, checking monitors, adjusting temperature levels, and wiping away any buildup from the compound with the same care he had shown from the beginning. And though they had not spoken for a while, the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt like the kind of silence that holds, meaning the kind that does not need to be filled with noise to be understood. The human medic Rin had stepped out briefly, leaving them alone, and the soft hum of machines was the only sound in the room as Lyra shifted slightly in her seat, wincing at the sting in her shoulder, before glancing at Mason, who noticed her movement immediately and came closer without a word, checking the bindings and lowering the chair's incline so she could relax more easily. She watched him work, his hands steady and sure, and something about the way he moved reminded her of the engineers back home, not in method, but in purpose. Only they were taught to value the system more than the individual, and this man clearly placed the person first every time. Lyra broke the silence, her voice low and cautious, as she asked him why he had gone against orders, why he had risked so much for an alien whose name he barely knew, and Mason looked at her without blinking and told her that where he came from, saving life, was not about species or rank or time. It was about doing the right thing when it mattered the most. She listened quietly, unsure how to respond, because no one had ever said those words to her before, and even now she could hardly believe them, yet his actions kept proving them again and again until doubt had no place to stand. He leaned back in his chair then and began speaking, not as a medic or engineer, but as a man sharing pieces of a past that shaped him, and Lyra listened more closely than she had listened to anything before. He told her about a mission on a frozen moon where the hull of a mining station had cracked and dozens were trapped inside with no way out, and while others planned evacuations and cutoffs, Mason and a few others stood through layers of ice and metal for hours, knowing the risk, knowing the odds, and yet they refused to give up because to them, one life was worth the fight, even if the outcome was uncertain. Lyra felt something stir within her, something old and buried deep beneath layers of training and structure, and she thought of her own childhood when her cousin had been injured in a factory collapse and the medics had arrived quickly but without emotion, slicing and sealing, without even looking her cousin in the eyes, and when it was over, they moved on to the next casualty as if nothing had happened. No one spoke of it again because it was efficient and necessary, and those were the values they lived by. But now, sitting here beside this human who remembered every life he had saved, and even the ones he had lost, she began to wonder if her people had forgotten something more important than speed and safety. She asked him then, what if it had gone wrong? What if she had lost her arm anyway? And Mason answered without hesitation that trying and failing was still better than never trying at all, because there was something deeply human about refusing to surrender without a fight. And Lyra looked at him not as a stranger, but as someone whose heart burned with a fire she had never seen before, a fire that refused to let others be reduced to statistics or protocols. The solvent had started to loosen more layers of the adhesive now, and Rin returned with a small tool that emitted precise vibrations, meant to break down molecular bonds gently and carefully, and Mason used it, slowly moving along the outer edge of the compound while Lyra kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling, not because of the pain, but because her mind was spinning with thoughts and questions and realizations that left her unsure of what she believed anymore. She remembered the academy where she had trained to become a technician, where they taught her how to calculate repairs in seconds, how to judge the worth of a damaged component, and how to act swiftly when a living worker became trapped in malfunctioning equipment. And she remembered how they praised her for quick decisions, for clean amputations, for cold logic that ignored emotion. And now she wondered how many lives she had saved and how many she had simply processed without ever knowing what they felt. Mason paused for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked at her again, asking how she was doing, and Lyra answered truthfully that she did not know because her body felt tired, but her thoughts felt wide open, like a door had been unlocked in her mind, and she did not know what waited on the other side. Mason gave a small nod and said, "That was how growth usually felt, strange, uncertain, but worth walking through." They worked in silence again, this time together, and with every piece of the compound that was lifted from her skin, Lyra felt lighter. Not just in body but in spirit, as if something toxic was being pulled from her. Not just the adhesive, but the fear that had gripped her since the moment she got trapped. She had believed her fate was sealed, that pain and loss were her only options. But this human had walked into her world and shown her another path, one built not on speed or sacrifice, but on patience, courage, and care. As the adhesive thinned and more of her natural skin became visible, she reached out with her right hand and touched Mason's arm gently, not in weakness but in silent thanks, and he understood without needing words, offering her a tired smile that said he was with her all the way. And in that quiet med bay, far from any home they had ever known, two beings from two different stars sat together, not as patient and healer, not as alien and human, but as people sharing something that could not be measured in logic or protocol. Lyra knew the journey was not over and the hardest part was still ahead, but she no longer felt alone, and she no longer believed in the cold rules that had once shaped her view of what life should be. She had crossed a line without even knowing it, not a boundary of space, but of understanding, and once crossed there was no turning back, because once you see a new way of living, you cannot unsee it. You cannot pretend it does not exist. You can only choose whether or not to follow it. And Lyra had already made her choice. The medbay lights had dimmed slightly as the ship rotated into the shadow of a nearby moon, casting everything in a calm blue hue that made the room feel slower, quieter, almost sacred in its silence. And yet, beneath the calm was a tension sharp and real, like the edge of a blade, hanging in the air, waiting for someone to breathe too loud or move too fast. Lyra lay back in the support chair, her body covered in light blankets to keep her warm, while her arm remained inside the containment field, where the final layers of adhesive still clung tightly around her forearm and elbow, and it was there where the most dangerous part of the work now remained. Mason stood beside her, adjusting the angle of the field light, with one hand while holding a precision tool in the other, a long, slender device that vibrated at a frequency tuned to weaken the deepest chemical bonds of the hardened adhesive. He had used it before during surface work on ship exteriors, where emergency foams hardened over metal, but this was the first time he would use it this close to living nerve pathways, and one mistake could send pain through her spine like a firestorm, or worse, cause permanent loss of sensation. He knew this, Lyra knew this. Everyone in the room understood the risk, and yet she had not pulled away. She had not asked him to stop. She watched him with quiet eyes that no longer held fear, but a strange calm, the kind that came not from confidence but from trust, and Mason felt that weight pressed gently against his shoulders as he leaned closer, preparing for the final stage. Rin stood nearby, monitoring vital signs, ready to intervene if anything went wrong, while the backup med team stood just outside the door, waiting but not interfering, because they had already seen enough to know this was not a standard case. This was something personal, something important beyond protocol. Lyra's voice broke the silence as she asked him if he had ever failed someone in a moment like this, and Mason paused only briefly before answering yes, with a voice soft but honest. He told her about a woman named Alan who had been caught in an orbital engine fire, and he had tried to save both her legs when everyone else said remove them both, but the heat damage had gone too far, and in the end he had lost the race against time, and she never walked again. He told her how he had stayed by her side for days after, and she had looked him in the eye and told him she was glad he tried, because even in losing, she had felt human, not disposable, and that had changed the way he worked forever. Lyra nodded, slowly understanding not just the story, but the feeling behind it, because she too had known What it felt like to be treated as a part of a machine, as something to be replaced, rather than healed, and now she felt herself held in a new kind of space. A human space where value was not measured in time saved, but in effort given. Mason moved again, positioning the tool over the thickest part of the compound, and asked her one last time if she was ready, and she answered without hesitation, her voice steady and sure. The tool began its work, a soft humming vibration pressing against the compound's core, and immediately the material began to react, curling, breaking, flaking away in fine crystal-like layers, and Lyra's breath hitched as a sharp pulse ran through her shoulder, not unbearable but intense, and she gritted, her teeth focusing on Mason's voice as he kept talking, guiding her through every second, reminding her to breathe, to stay still, to trust him. The work was slow and precise, every motion calculated, every adjustment made with the kind of care that only came from someone who had spent their life refusing to let go, even when logic said it was the only option. Sweat gathered on Mason's brow and dripped down the side of his face, but he did not wipe it away, his eyes fixed on the thin, shimmering line of her skin, now visible beneath the final threads of the adhesive, and he adjusted the tool, once more leaning in close, as the last layer loosened. The ship groaned softly as it shifted its orbit, but inside the med bay, no one moved, no one spoke, no one dared interrupt. The moment that held more than just a chance of success. It held the weight of two worlds learning how to meet in the space between. Then it happened, a sudden spike in her heart, rate a flash of red across the vital screen, and Mason froze his tool mid-motion while Rin moved forward, checking her readings, asking her where it hurt, but Lyra shook her head, her voice breathless, saying it was not pain, it was something else, a strange surge of heat through her spine, like her nerves were waking up after being asleep for too long. Rin checked again, then looked at Mason and gave a small nod, and so he continued slower, now even more carefully, until the very last fragment of the adhesive compound lifted free, falling onto the tray below like a shard of glass no longer needed. Her arm was free, weak and pale but free. The room remained silent as Mason powered down the tool and removed the containment field, then placed a light sensor over her skin and scanned for nerve reaction. He called her name softly, and she opened her eyes and raised her fingers ever so slightly, and the moment they moved even a little, a wave of emotion passed through the med bay, like light cutting through fog, and Lyra felt something behind her eyes burn hot and unfamiliar, and she turned her face away, not out of shame, but because she had never been allowed to cry before, not in front of others, not like this. Mason placed his hand over hers and said, "Welcome back," and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe she had not just survived, maybe she had been transformed. Outside the med bay, some of the alien crew still waited, unsure how to react, unsure how to explain what had just happened. But none of them spoke, not even Bren, who had once demanded immediate amputation, because now they had seen what could happen when someone refused to follow only the path of least resistance. Lyra looked at her hand, watched it flex weakly, and then turned to Mason and asked what came next, and he told her recovery. Slow exercises, strength, returning day by day, and she asked if she could learn how humans train medics and how they taught people to think this way, and he smiled and said there was always a place for someone who wanted to understand. In that quiet moment, beneath the hum of machinery and the whisper of new possibilities, Lyra knew she had reached a point from which there was no return, and yet she did not fear it, because this path, though strange and uncertain, felt more true than anything she had ever followed before, and now she was no longer just a worker, or a patient, or a technician. She was someone who had been seen, who had been saved, who had chosen to trust when everything in her past told her not to. And for the first time, her heart did not brace for the worst. It beat with the rhythm of hope. Days passed slowly, like quiet waves brushing the edge of a distant shore, and within the med bay, where pain once echoed and uncertainty hung heavy, a new rhythm had begun to take shape, a rhythm not built on urgency or fear, but on gentle progress and the soft return of movement. Strength and purpose. Lyra sat near the wide viewing glass where space shimmered beyond like a river of silver stars, and she flexed her fingers one by one, watching the small muscles respond to the signals from her mind, feeling the ache but also the quiet satisfaction of control, returning to what was almost lost. Beside her lay a smooth sphere no larger than her palm, a human-designed rehab tool given to her by Mason, who had said it would help her rebuild strength. But secretly she believed it held more meaning than that it was a symbol of what had been saved and what had been transformed. Each day she would grip it and roll it in her hand, and with each turn she reminded herself of the moment when choice had returned to her life, not just physical choice, but the choice to see the world in a new way. Mason entered the room carrying a data tablet and 2 steaming cups of nutrient tea, his footsteps steady his presence, familiar now, like part of the air around her, and when he offered her a cup she took it with her healing hand, her fingers trembling only slightly as she raised it and drank. They sat together without rush, speaking of small things like ship repairs and supply updates. But woven into the quiet conversation was something deeper, a bond formed, not by shared origin, but by shared experience, by the trust that had been built not through words alone, but through action and care. Outside the med bay, the crew had begun to shift in subtle ways too. The event had traveled across the halls and decks of the freighter, carried in whispers and wide eyes, some skeptical, some curious, but none untouched. Engineers who once followed strict timelines began asking questions about alternate methods, and safety officers revised emergency protocols to include human suggestions that previously had been ignored. For the first time, the idea that saving more than what was efficient could be worth the effort began to grow like a seed in soil that had never known such roots before. Lyra returned to her crew after clearance from the medics, her steps slower than before, but her eyes steady and alert, and when she stepped into the main bay, where tools hissed and engines roared, the others turned to look not with pity, but with quiet respect. She was no longer just another technician. She had become something more, not because she survived, but because she had shown what survival could mean, when it was led by hope and not by fear. Her commanding officer approached, a tall figure with gray eyes that once held only logic, but now seemed to carry a question as well, and he asked her what she had learned during her recovery. And Lyra answered not with science or systems, but with a story, the story of a human who chose to save an arm that others would have cut, the story of a moment when procedure bent to compassion and created a new outcome. She spoke without pride and without weakness, only with clarity, and when she finished there was a long silence, after which the officer nodded and said perhaps it was time to rewrite what had always been followed without thought. Weeks passed and her hand continued to grow stronger, and during that time Lyra requested something unexpected. She asked for a temporary transfer to the human section of the ship, where she could observe their medical routines and understand their choices, not to mimic, but to learn to carry something valuable back to her own people, something she now believed could reshape more than just emergency response. Permission was granted with caution, but also with a measure of curiosity, for if one moment could change so much, perhaps more moments were waiting to be discovered. Mason greeted her with a smile when she arrived in the human wing, a small bag over her shoulder and a data slate in her hand, ready to begin again, not as a patient. And as they walked down the corridor toward the med training room, he told her that change always begins in the smallest places, like a single hand choosing to hold on instead of letting go. Lyra listened closely, her steps slow but sure, and as they entered the room where young medics trained, she felt the future stretch wide before her, not as a path already built, but as one waiting to be walked. Inside the training hall, holograms flickered, showing wound simulations and treatment maps, and Mason introduced her not as a guest, but as someone who had lived through the lessons they now taught, and the students listened not just out of respect, but out of real interest, for they had heard about her not through reports, but through shared words, passed from one mouth to another like stories that carried truth deeper than data ever could. She spoke to them not in complex language, but in simple sentences describing the feeling of being seen not as a task to manage, but as a life worth fighting for, and she watched as their eyes widened not in shock, but in understanding. Later that evening, as the ship drifted quietly along its route, Lyra stood once again near the viewing glass, holding the smooth rehab sphere in her palm, watching it glow faintly in the starlight. And behind her, Mason stepped up beside her, silent for a long moment before speaking in a low voice, asking if she regretted anything. She turned to him and answered no, not even the pain, not even the fear, because through it, she had gained something more than healing. She had found a truth that would guide her forever. And Mason nodded slowly, not needing to say more. And as the stars continued to stretch across the sky like endless roads leading to places unknown, Lyra felt something strong rise within her, not the old readiness for loss, but a readiness for possibility, for rebuilding, for showing others that even when a system says cut, there's always another way if someone dares to try. She had braced for the worst, but in the hands of a human who chose to save rather than surrender, she had found more than survival. She had found wholeness and a purpose reborn. And that was how it ended, not with silence or sorrow, but with a new standard written not in rules, but in choice, a choice to believe that every life, every limb, every chance is worth fighting for. And in that belief, a new future had already begun. The end.